to Lawgical, the UAE's first and still the only regular legal podcast. My name's Tim Elliott, and as always, Lawgical comes to you from the Dubai-based legal firm, HBL Yamalova and Plethka. And here is the managing partner, Ludmila Yamalova. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too, Tim. Thanks for being here.
Now, this episode of Lawgical, Ludmila, is kind of special. It's new. Hot off the press, and I really mean that. You in your practice have recently made history in the UAE with the enforcement of a foreign judgment. So that's what we're going to talk about, along with LY Law making history as well. Let's get to the juicy details a little bit later, but just first of all, in general terms, because there's a lot to take in here, would you set the stage, just outline the bones of the story, if you like, and also define the term foreign judgment for everybody?
Sure. So let's perhaps start with the basic question. What is the foreign judgment and why is it important? So in very simple terms, a foreign judgment, it's a judgment that's issued by a court of a different jurisdiction from a different country and that is being enforced or is attempted to be enforced in a different country. So let's say, and we can use actually very specific examples because that's the example we'll talk about today. Let's say it's a judgment from the United States. It's a U.S. judgment that was not enforced in the U.S. and instead is being enforced in the UAE. Right. So that's the concept of a foreign judgment. Now, in the definition of foreign judgment, now why is it important? And it's important for a number of reasons, and that is that especially in today's day and age, in this sort of very global environment, global world. People move a lot. We're all very transient, very mobile, and people touch a lot of different places in one way or another without necessarily being permanently attached or even regularly attached to that particular place. So, for example, you go to the U.S., you make an investment in the U.S., but you don't live there. You're not a resident of the U.S. You not a citizen of the U.S., and you don't work in the U.S., but you just were traveling and saw a property, you bought a property, voila, you touched that jurisdiction. So if there's a dispute, for example, involving that particular property in the U.S., and there's a judgment that's entered against the party that, again, who is not a U.S. citizen, not a U.S. resident, does not live in the U.S., does not reside in the U.S., and does not work in the U.S., and in any other way, so it does not really touch the country. So now you've got this judgment. What can you do with it? If the person doesn't have any assets in the U.S. either, so you cannot really enforce the judgment because it's the person is not there, nor does that person have any ascertainable assets, which you can try to seize in order to satisfy the judgment. So that's why. So and these kinds of incidents happen all too often, and that is people will incur, let's say, obligation of one type or another in one country, and then run away from the obligation to another country. So this is why the idea of enforcement of foreign judgment, or the topic of enforcement of judgment, is an important one. It's an important one because of the world we live in today. And because these kinds of incidents and these kind of examples happen all too often, it's a very common topic, and perhaps where we have seen or have heard more about the judgments, foreign judgments being enforced, are in two different contexts. One is personal status. And that's in alimony, for example. So that is, it's been a fairly established practice of, for example, if you have an alimony judgment, and that, not to stereotype anyone, but often these alimony judgments are against the father, who basically has the obligation to pay alimony to the children and doesn't, and so leaves the country, so just to avoid paying. So, for example, these kinds of judgments, these sort of alimony judgments historically have been enforced through other kind of even expedited methods through the embassies and the sort of foreign offices, and that's with the idea, again, because you're trying to the interest of the state to preserve the children and their financial stability. So if you're kind of one of those, again, not to stereotype, and forgive me for using these kinds of phrases, but they do kind of exist in the context of this discussion, deadbeat father. that just running away from your obligations. So these kinds of court judgments and alimony judgments, for example, historically have been more commonly enforced in other jurisdictions because sort of for all the obvious reasons, right? Because it's the interest of the children that are at stake. So we've heard those kind of cases being more successful or more effective than criminal cases as well. So, for example, if you have, let's use a very sort of extreme example. You murdered someone. I mean, a murder is a murder everywhere, right? It's basically a crime. So if you murdered somebody in, let's say, Australia and then moved to the UAE, I mean, you're still, that's a, it's a fairly objective case where you don't need to necessarily prove that, well, in Australia this was illegal, but in the UAE it may be legal. So so criminal enforcement of criminal judgments therefore have also historically been more effective. And criminal judgments usually are followed by, for example, what's called the extradition request. So where there is a criminal judgment, let's say in Sweden and Finland for, let's say, tax evasion, if it's a criminal judgment, and then the person resides in the UAE, and so again, people are running away from their obligations, right, or from their liabilities, or from basically serving their punishment, and because we do live in such a global world, one, and two, a lot of the passports these days will open up doors to many different countries. So we've also heard the idea of or the topic of foreign judgments enforced in the UAE in terms of the criminal context more often. So there have been recently cases, for example, where exactly for like tax evasion and fraud, a judgment from a foreign jurisdiction, let's say Finland or Norway or Denmark, and the authorities of that country basically pursuing the person in, let's say, the UAE, and trying to make an extradition request to the UAE. Dear UAE, this person's residing in your country. We've got a criminal judgment against them. We want to extradite them. Now, it's topic of extradition is a different topic, and we'll dedicate a separate podcast for this because it's a very interesting and a very timely and topical discussion. But it's relevant in the context of enforcement of judgments because it is also a form of enforcement of a judgment, a foreign judgment. It's just that criminal judgments you historically have seen have been perhaps more readily enforced in other jurisdictions, or at least assisted by foreign authorities, such as extraditing the person, because it's criminal in nature, right? So now, in terms of civil judgments, what are we talking about? Civil. So we're talking about personal status. That's kind of alimony disputes, for example. Then you have criminal. Fraud or murder and drugs, terrorist kind of examples. Those, but then there's the civil judgments where literally you just basically there's a court judgment against you for, let's say, non-payment of a debt. It could be a commercial debt. It could be breaching an agreement and there's some sort of financial obligations. That could be out of tort, where you've done something wrong and there's a compensation that the court awarded. So it's basically ultimately it's a civil dispute that has a commercial element to it, i.e. a civil dispute that be it breach of contract, tort, loan, so default on loan, or any kind of other personal set of obligations. So it's civil in nature, but there is a monetary compensation that's attached to that by virtue of the court's decision. So in other words, let's say you breached on that, you bought a property and you took a loan and you stopped paying the loan. So now the bank will bring a case against you, and because you took the money from the bank and you just stopped paying it. So the bank will bring a case against you. So it's a civil dispute, but there will be a court judgment that says, okay, you, Tim, you stole money, and now you have to return that money, plus there could be compensation. So different jurisdictions assign different penalties and compensation in addition to the underlying, perhaps your monetary claim.
Right.
So So in other words, ultimately you have a judgment that is civil in nature, but it has a monetary compensation attached to it. So it's a civil or it becomes a commercial obligation. So as per this judgment, you, Tim, owe me, for example, $100,000. So and so these kinds of these judgments, because they're not personal status and they're not as alimony judgments, so they're not as sort of aided by other foreign government judgments in the same way as alimony judgments are, and they're not criminal in nature, so therefore they're not being sort of acted on as efficiently and perhaps more sort of more seriously as civil judgments. So the civil judgments don't have that kind of gravitas, if you will. So therefore, historically, they have not been as readily enforced in just amongst the countries. So there's that. Now, on top of that, there is also which countries we're talking about. So if you're, for example, and not to offend anyone, but let's say if you are you're coming from England and you've got a judgment from Yemen you're trying to enforce in England. The courts will also look at the underlying fabric of basically the country and the judicial system from where you're trying to enforce the judgment. So, but there's also this general concept of sovereignty, which is courts don't like to be sort of told by other courts of other countries what to do, right? So, and that obviously is backed by the idea of the whole sort of as part of being sovereign state, you have your own laws. So just because something is illegal or criminal in your country, it may not be in my country. And I don't want you to tell me, you court in, for example, England, tell me, the court in the UAE, what to do. So there's a little bit that's also historically, there's been a bit of this kind of resentment. A default resentment, like I'm not going to, just because it's a judgment from a foreign court, just because it's a court judgment, I'm not going to enforce it at face value. So that's kind of the overall premise, perhaps historically. Now, obviously, over the years, a lot of countries have similar judicial systems, similar economical standing, similar sort of rights and protection of citizens and residents. So there's more recognition in terms of, okay, if you have a judgment from the U.S. versus UK, those two. So the judgment, a British judgment or English judgment in the U.S. will be a lot more perhaps readily reviewed and enforced just because of the relationship between the two countries. So there's that. So over the years, obviously, there's a lot more these kinds of countries that are work closely together and cooperate closely together. So therefore, judgments between them or for their own courts have given this sort of mutual recognition.
Okay.
All right. It's called the principle of comity, which is a recognition of another court's judgment.
Right.
So, and the world being as global, as sort of accepting as it has been, there's a lot more of these partnerships between and collaborations and cooperation between countries. There's a lot more countries that are now cooperating on that basis. On the one hand, because of sort of their underlying kind of workings as countries are concerned, but on the other hand, also some countries do this because they've taken a step forward and they've signed special treaties. So, for example, let's say you're from England and I'm from Finland. So we decided we will sign a treaty that specifically expressly states that our judgments will be mutually recognized. Okay. So sometimes foreign judgments are enforced because of the treaty, because there's a treaty between the two countries, and other times it's just because of this sort of principle of comity, it's called. It's where you recognize that you live in what I perceive to be a fairly established and developed country, and you coming to my country, which is fairly established and developed. So I'll recognize the judgment of your courts, and by just basically giving it recognition. Without having to really litigate the case. But there are a few caveats. And the main caveat that I've sort of seen kind of throughout, and that is as long as that particular judgment is not against public morals or public order of the country. And I'll give you examples. And so, for example, let's say... you have a judgment between, we've talked before in the past, this is kind of a little bit of a wild example, but let's say in some countries, cannabis, right, is not illegal. And let's say if you have a license and you trade cannabis, and let's say you are the cannabis trader and I took your cannabis and I didn't pay for it, for example, right? And so you go to court because in that particular country you were acting within the parameters of the law. You're not doing anything illegal, so you have a judgment. And I took your stuff and I didn't pay you for it, right? So it's a commercial transaction. It's a civil dispute, commercial transaction. There's a financial compensation attached to it. So in that particular country, let's say it could be Netherlands. Or the U.S. So that judgment is valid. Now, if you're trying to enforce, you chase me. I'm not in the U.S. or the Netherlands. I've moved to the UAE, and now you're trying to chase me. I owe you, let's say, $1 million. You're trying to chase me here. Now, the UAE, let's say UK, U.S., whatever, the Netherlands, they may think of each other as, okay, our countries and our judicial systems are sort of similar enough. We want to honor this sort of principle of comity, of recognition of each other's judgments. But hang on a second, cannabis in the UAE is illegal. So for us to enforce that kind of a judgment would be against public morals. So that's one of the perhaps main reasons that permeates, it seems, that all judicial systems is that they, and that, by the way, happens even if you have a treaty involved. If there's a specific treaty between the two countries that clearly states that we will recognize each other's judgments. But if recognizing your judgment would ultimately have violate the public morals or public principles of my country, the courts basically, that is one ground, consistent ground, in which the courts will say, sorry, for any other judgment, yes, but not this particular judgment because it violates our fundamental morals or principles. So that's kind of how foreign judgments in general in the world and kind of historically sort of treated, and that's why they're important, is because these days it's all too easy for people to just go and take an obligation in one country, run away from that obligation, and move to a different country. And we've seen it all too often, and interestingly enough, the UAE being kind of truly like almost in the heart of the world in terms of geographically, it's so conveniently located to so many different parts of the world. One, it's an incredibly rapidly developing, and a very progressive place to live, and a very comfortable place to live. Mm-hmm. And they're very welcoming of people from all different jurisdictions in terms of passports, and especially now there's these special golden visas we've discussed before on our podcasts, and different types of visas that allow people to stay in the country a lot longer, invest here, and have many benefits. So the UAE historically has also been kind of a very popular place for people to come and live, and want to live for different reasons, but including those perhaps who want to kind of run away from their obligations, because one of the other main factors, in addition to the ones I've described, is it's an English language based country, although obviously Arabic here is the official language, but on a day-to-day basis we're all speaking English, right? So it's one thing, like let's say if you're trying to run away from France, living in China may be a little more difficult, right? Or in some sort of African country where English is limited utility. But in a place like the UAE, there has a very welcoming and visa regime. It's very geographically well located, convenient located. It's very modern, very progressive. It's very comfortable. It's just there's great infrastructure. There's a lot of opportunities here to work and live and invest. So because of all these reasons, and until recently there wasn't much of a tax here as well. It's changing right before our eyes. But for all the many good reasons and deserving reasons, the UAE has been a very popular place for people to come and live and park themselves here, including those who are perhaps trying to run away from some of their obligations. And we have seen this all too often, and I've been here for 15 years, and I've seen people. I remember I saw in 2008 when I came here, there's a lot of people that were basically that came from like Hong Kong and Singapore to the UAE, foreigners, so Europeans who had lived in Hong Kong and Singapore, and apparently later you'll find out, they had to leave Hong Kong or Singapore because they were conducting some sort of financial trading without a proper license, so there was a case against them, so they ended up here. And because the UAE was such a new country, the sort of vetting process of people and their backgrounds wasn't implemented right away. It's today we know. So if you're claiming to be an engineer, you need to show me your certificates, and these certificates have to be properly attested. It wasn't always like this. So basically, you could have come here before. You could come here before and be whoever you wanted to be, and people would take it at face value. So, I mean, there's many reasons, right? But basically, historically, the UAE has also been one of those kind of popular places for some of these people who don't want to pay their obligations to park themselves here, and so. And the topic of foreign judgment, enforcement of civil judgments, right? So criminal judgments have been sort of acted on here and there with extradition requests and even extradition deportations and such. But in terms of civil judgments, it hasn't been as welcoming or receptive the country and its judicial system has not been as receptive of having civil judgments be enforced in the UAE as part of the judicial system.
Okay, but that is changing, which gives me the opportunity to say to you, right, tell us about this, one particular case, I guess, the first US civil judgment enforced in the UAE. Now, I have a million questions, and the issue I've got is trying to put them into some sort of order, but I know you're going to anticipate lots of them. So let's talk about the case, and I know you have to talk about it in broad terms, but you had to navigate, I guess, and re-navigate, and then re-navigate again for this to come to fruition. Talk me through how long, what the case was, how long it took, the obstacles you faced, and I guess ultimately why things changed the way they did.
Yeah, so this is truly, as you said, and as I like to say, we are making history, and that is perhaps also why I have remained in this country for so long. Because as I often say, it's like I feel like often that I'm sort of in the thick of the history in the making, because this country is changing so rapidly and growing, progressing, and developing forward so quickly that you do often feel like, especially in my industry as a lawyer, you feel like you are seeing these new laws change, and you are part of the implementation of these new laws.
I mean, that's been the thing with you and me, isn't it? We've talked about this ad infinitum. It was, let's do some podcasts. So we did a few podcasts. And now, and I'm not making this up, keeping up with the changes is difficult. There's so much happening legally.
Absolutely. And I'd say I even add more to it. And it's because of, for example, the... among other things, obviously, but even our podcast. That in addition to us as legal practitioners and our sort of as our little podcast, in addition to being part of implementing the changes, I think we're also influencing the change. Okay. And influencing even new laws and new amendments to the laws and more change. And how? Because basically by spreading the word and communicating and sharing the knowledge and the feedback that we as legal practitioners experience, and we feed it through our podcast and other social media updates. And so in response to that, we have also seen sort of the law change and the kind of the business practices and the legal practices evolve. So I'd like to take a little bit of credit here and there that we've played a small part in helping legislation move forward. So that's one of the exciting part about being in the UAE. But and that's what kept me here. I came here for what I thought was going to be 1 year, and look, it's 15 years now. I'm still here. Same office. Same office. So. But this particular case has always been an interesting one, because this judgment, it was a U.S. judgment. It involved basically a client who secured a civil judgment that had a monetary value to it, about $1 million, against a foreign citizen in the U.S. But the case was actually brought in and get sort of originally the case was brought over a dispute over property between the two parties, and so the property was based in the U.S. and so so therefore obviously the courts in the U.S. had the jurisdiction because it related to the property, and then there was some other sort of claims of tort. There's a counterclaim that happened as part of tort, and so again related to the U.S. and the U.S. courts had jurisdiction over all of these different matters. So there was a judgment ultimately that was issued against the defendant for $1 million, and then it basically, and all the appeals and all that sort of the final stages had already passed, and the judgment ultimately became final. Now, because it involved a party that a defendant who was not a U.S. citizen and did not live in the U.S. and did not work in the U.S., had no assets in the U.S., at least significant assets at that point in time. So you have this judgment, a very well-reasoned and a sort of a kind of a belabored judgment, because it had gone through different stages until it became final and non-appealable, and a lot of sort of service and documentation had been done to make sure that this judgment is final, and it's all the dots are, or the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. And so, and then you ultimately have this judgment, but the person doesn't have any interest in the U.S. And so what value do you have in this judgment? So the defendant actually was based, at least here and there at different times, different parts, was based in the UAE. So not a UAE national, a European national, but was resident in the UAE at times full-time, at other times kind of part-time. So we tried basically from early on to enforce that judgment in the UAE courts. However, there were a number of impediments at the time. And that kind of goes back to your questions, what has been the journey, our journey. And that's been the journey because it's kind of a long process. Because at the time, and that was almost 10 years ago, the UAE legal system basically was not very receptive to enforcement of foreign judgments. There are a number of requirements that made it a lot more difficult to try to enforce the foreign judgment. And at a high level, the main reason for that is that the laws seem to require an existence of a treaty between the two countries. So in other words, there should have been a treaty between the UAE and the US in order for the UAE to enforce, to want to enforce the US judgment. And that's what we spoke earlier. Your courts historically, or countries historically have been enforcing each other's or refusing to enforce each other's judgments on the basis of either sort of this implicit recognition of each other's competence or explicit by virtue of a treaty. Right. And so, but the UAE's laws at the time basically had this requirement of a treaty. So it was in a way a non-starter because there was not a treaty between the US and the UAE at the time, nor is there one today still. Interestingly enough, and there's another sort of twist to it. Those who've listened to our podcast in the past would have perhaps listened to this on podcast about the different types of legal systems in the UAE, because we also have a DIFC court here, which is a very sort of a court within the court, or I guess jurisdiction within a different jurisdiction. It's almost like an independent, like a Vatican type jurisdiction in Italy. So, and that's called the Dubai International Financial Center Court, or the DIFC, and that's an English sort of common law jurisdiction in the midst of a civil law, which the rest of the UAE is, and it's an English-based court, and it's mainly English-trained judges, and so it's based on the laws of the DFC are based on sort of English laws. So for a time, there was even a period where the DIFC courts, because they were more, so they're based on common law system and an English system and English laws, and they're presided by mainly English-trained judges. So they were more receptive to the idea of enforcing foreign judgments. And for a while, in particular, the DFC had even created this reputation for itself. It was called the conduit jurisdiction, where you bring, for example, it was specific, especially I don't want to call it popular, but effective and successful with regards to enforcing arbitration awards, foreign arbitration awards, or just arbitration awards. Is that you bring it to the DIFC, you sort of domesticate it in the DIFC. And then once you have a judgment, because from the DFC courts, then you take it to the local courts and you try to enforce it to the local courts already as a UAE judgment from the DFC courts, not as a foreign judgment, but I guess a UAE judgment, but issued by a different court. So for a while, there was even basically we even investigated and explored that option of the DIFC courts, using DFC courts to basically domesticate the judgment or localize the judgment here, and then try to enforce in the local courts.
So that's like a ratification, isn't it, I guess?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yes, right. The ratification. Now, the DFC courts is not inexpensive. It's actually, because it's all in dollars, it's quite, and when you're talking about a judgment that's $1 million, the fees to the courts was quite expensive, so the client wasn't really in the position at the time to try. That's in addition, you pay court fees and you pay lawyer fees, and every hearing costs in dollars. So it's a really committed exercise. And that kind of happened at the same time also when the DFC courts retracted a little bit their conduit jurisdiction influence or powers, and that was probably it's typical in so many other jurisdictions and countries with multiple judicial and jurisdictional districts. Is what's called a conflict of interest, conflict of laws, perhaps not interest, but conflict of laws. Right. So when there's one state is challenging the other state's jurisdiction. So same thing here with the local courts and the DFC DFC courts was a little bit of a conflict of laws, sort of evolution that was happening. So as part of it, then the DFC seemed to have kind of retracted a little bit of that power of localizing or ratifying a foreign judgment. But that's just to give you an idea how, what we had to go through. So, and also on top of that, we worried, okay, even if we have a judgment from the DIFC, it can be extraordinarily expensive. But then again, when they bring it back to try to enforce it in the local courts, could that potentially cause problems for the same reason? Because ultimately there wasn't a treaty between the two countries. So, and then we had to research high and low the judgments or precedents, the UAE from the local courts, to see if there was anything that's similar, in particular for enforcement of U.S. judgment. There were a few judgments, for example, from different countries, like where you have a lot of residents, the sort of heavy numbers of residents, like India. There seemed to be a little more recognition, but also there's some treaties that are signed between the UAE and some other countries where it was those countries where there was a treaty, there was more of a recognition of judgment on the basis of those treaties. But nothing on the U.S. So certainly not a civil judgment. So we didn't really have any. So the laws did not really help us because they seemed to require the treaty, and then the DFC court was not very helpful because it kind of it was very expensive and was still very uncertain, and the practice was kind of changing, and the courts themselves and the precedents we could not find much help in that department. So there just were no cases to rely on. So in other words, there had not been a civil judgment from the U.S. that we were able to find all these years that we could kind of use as a precedent to argue off of. Well, and now fast forward. So, but attempts were made, and judgment sort of had been the U.S. judgment had been domesticated here, kind of on this different fronts, had been translated and used in different junctions to try to serve. And the defendant actually knew that he was being chased here as well, but just with the same kind of audacity of carelessness, I don't care about the U.S. judgment attitude. It was basically the same judgment, the same attitude it was treated here. I don't care. Certainly he was aware. Now, as we know, laws have been changing a lot in the last, since COVID. I will forever be grateful to COVID for that, because there's so many positive legislative changes that happen in this country in particular, and we're kind of in the thick of it all. We've benefited intellectually and professionally from all these legislative developments. So it's been exciting, but it's also been very rewarding because we've seen a lot of cases where we can actually really help people. And we've talked about on this podcast before about the out of wedlock babies, for example, and bounce checks. These are all good examples of how something that used to be, and even the drug offenses, things that used to be just categorically considered criminal and punished by jail sentences, those crimes were basically being amended, and we were able to help a lot of people on the back of these new laws. And so it's kind of exciting era for us as legal practitioners. Now, as part of these changes as well, there was also a decision that amended. It was Decision 75 of 2021 that amended basically the Article 85 of the Civil Procedure Law. And the Civil Procedure Law, that's basically the law that sets out, that sets out different procedural regulations in terms of the court practice in the UAE, in simple terms. And so, there's this Article 85 of the Civil Procedure Law specifically that governs the enforcement of foreign judgments. So it's a specific article in the UAE Civil Procedure Law that sets out, okay, there is a procedure for enforcement of foreign judgment. And basically just kind of in short, the principles of the general framework of this Article 85. Is just that the default principles that the foreign judgments may be ordered and enforced in the UAE, and basically as per the same sort of conditions as they were enforced in the local courts or in the foreign court. And some of the other requirements is the UAE courts cannot have exclusive jurisdiction. So in other words, so if the UAE had exclusive jurisdiction over that particular party or that case, then other judgment from the other court would not have been enforced here. So that was one of the conditions. And then also that the foreign court that issued the judgment was the competent court. It had the jurisdiction and competency to basically rule on a specific issue. And obviously, as I said before, that it doesn't violate the public order or public morals, and so not against the sort of overall country's policy. And there's a few kind of other nuances that the sort of principle of fairness, making sure the defendant, for example, was served properly, but it's kind of embedded as a general principle of this Article 85, and that's again sort of in terms of the processes were all followed properly. The party had been served and had the opportunity to defend themselves, and they had been informed of this judgment and such. So, as you might have noted, this Article 85 makes no mention of the treaty. But remember, we're talking about 2021, and the article itself might not have changed so much. The wording of it has not been amended so much, but it was more just that the UAE practice, in addition to how the previous language of the article was drafted, it had this kind of embedded expectation of the treaty. Between the countries for enforcement or recognition of judgments. Yep. So therefore, everything else before then was always came back to the same. Okay, well, is there a treaty between the two countries? And that seemed to be all the other kind of cases we saw or precedents we saw. That was kind of the sticking point. And if there was no treaty, the judgment ultimately was not enforced. And then basically that was in 2021, along with other legislative amendments. There's so many new changes, and there was a few statements. I think the public, the UAE Attorney General even made a statement. That kind of a statement and directive and guidance to judges, to UAE judges, that basically that we should be enforcing foreign judgments as long as they meet the criteria as per the laws, and then basically, there's expectations sort of reciprocity that our UAE judgment should also be equally, that other countries are also going to be enforcing our judgments if we're basically enforcing their judgment. So there's kind of a few little trends that are happening at the same time. So that's when we seized the moment, and we thought, okay, well, and then a few other still procedural laws that had been over the last few years introduced that gave a few more procedural tools for us to try out to see if we can enforce this judgment. So it's a very long journey so far. So we're now in 2021, so what we did is we filed what's called an order on petition. An order on petition you can file for something where you're basically asking, it's an administrative request to the court, and we've dedicated specific podcasts to this very topic, those who want to learn more about it. But it's a kind of administrative request to the court where you're saying something has already been decided or something is very clear, and we just want the court to basically say yes and or no. So there's no service on the other party. Just say this, and not all requests fall under this sort of order and petition type, and the courts can reject them. And so we thought, okay, listen, we have a U.S. judgment, so it's already been decided. Substantively, the issue has been decided. So it's basically a debt that the defendant has not paid. And also, yes, one of the other factors that happened along the way is that the defendant, we found out that he moved back into the UAE and he was not based here, and so it made sense to pursue him because for a while he was actually living, I think, somewhere in the African continent. So now he was in the UAE, so that's another reason that kind of made it perhaps the right time to start to see if we can now, with this, using the benefit of these new laws, to apply and enforce this U.S. judgment. So we filed this order on petition and requested for the court to basically just issue a decision. Yes, this judgment should be kind of enforced here. Now the courts, the judge said, well, in short, we need a treaty. And so it's a treaty that required the basis for mutual recognition between the two countries and of mutual recognition of judgment. So, well, there was no treaty, and we even appealed that decision. That's the court of first instance. We appealed the decision stating that Article 85 that applies to enforcement of foreign judgments does not require an existence of a treaty. But perhaps because it's a judge of first instance and because there's decades of precedence behind that judge and in the UAE jurisprudence where the treaty was always the requirement, there wasn't basically, that was sort of the precedent had developed, the thinking and the mentality that had been developed. So the judge said, well, no, we need a treaty. So then we appealed the decision to the Court of Appeals, and we cited, again, and said, listen, the Article 85 of the UAE Civil Procedural Laws does not require a treaty. All the other factors that basically have been met. So, for example, the original dispute was related to the U.S. It kind of stems from the property. So the defendant was not only sort of served and informed of the case. He's the one who initiated the case and litigated the case first. So he was part of the case. He initiated it. He was served. He even represented himself to an extent. And so you cannot claim that he did not know. So they said that's one of the requirements of Article 85, and that also that the court was a competent jurisdiction because it involved a property dispute in the U.S. and there was obviously that court's jurisdiction, and that also it did not violate public morals. It was not against the UAE public policies or public morals. And the treaty is not required, so therefore it should be enforced. So that's sort of what we argued to the Court of Appeals. And lo and behold, the Court of Appeals agreed with us, which was a great success because, as I just described, kind of in the backdrop of this is the first, at least, and we've looked high and low, at least in our practice, and so our exhaustive search is the first U.S. civil judgment that we saw being enforced in the UAE, and specifically where the courts are saying, the treaty between the two countries, U.S. and the UAE, is not required.
So what does the judgment mean? I mean, assuming you've got over the fact that actually this has happened, the shock or amazement and whatever other emotions that were running through you. But what does the judgment mean? Because getting a judgment is fine, but all of a sudden you have to enforce it.
Yes, well, but that was a little still premature because it was only a judgment of the Court of Appeals. I mean, what it meant to us at the time is the intellectual excitement. Right, it's just because wow. I mean, because also remember we just reversed. So the Court of First Instance ruled that the treaty was required, and there was no treaty. So, and that's exactly sort of the kind of the concern we had all these years. And now the Court of Appeals said, well, in fact, you're correct. The treaty is not required. And as long as the other elements are met, and you've demonstrated all the other elements are met, the treaty is not required. So they reversed, they reversed the Court of First Instance judgment, which is always very exciting for an attorney, for litigator, when that happens, when it's reversed in your favor. So, and then more specifically, the court said, well, yes, the treaty is not required, and this is a U.S. judgment, so basically it meets all the other elements, and so we recognize that the U.S. court has jurisdiction. There's nothing against public morals, and so therefore this judgment should be enforced without the requirement of a treaty. And this is the first U.S. judgment that we found. So that's another point of excitement. Yeah. And that's not to mention just the excitement of like, wow, we're now finally seeing that potentially there's a possibility of at least bringing this person to justice, because I mean that's truly what was happening. Is this person was just running away. He was fully aware of his obligations and the liability, and that he had kind of left carnage similar type in other countries with other jurisdictions. So this is not the first time event. So it's not perhaps a person of the most kind of the ethics or morals, but there's he's not one of there's many like that. I'm sure we all can point to a few in all of our lives. But anyway, so it was a little bit of satisfaction of that as well. So wow, that this person may be actually finally kind of held to account.
Or at least you're getting close, because okay, so I jumped forward a little bit. There was another stage to go to before you get a final
Yes.
judgment, right?
Yes. So predictably, and we knew this, the defendant appealed the Court of Cassation judgment. Again, because this is all new, we're at the forefront of the history in the making, so we really did not know what to expect. But the fact that it's basically not being reviewed by the Court of Cassation is that much more exciting, because obviously the Court of Cassation is the Court of Cassation. They tend to be more experienced, more senior judges, and so therefore their decisions have also a lot more gravitas. Not to mention that it's actually the final decision once they issue a decision. So. In short, the Court of Cassation also ruled in our favor, confirming basically what's called dismissing the cassation, saying, listen, there's no reason for this cassation request for the defendant because the Court of Appeals had ruled properly. So we confirmed the Courts of Appeals judgment, which, by the way, is also another kind of step. And for a lawyer, it's exciting, and so in the particular case, it was interesting. But because often what happens with courts of cassation, if they just affirm the judgment of the Court of Appeals, they say, listen, no, there's no reason for cassation, no reason for review. We confirm and affirm the lower courts, the Court of Appeals judgment, and that's it. And they don't elaborate anymore on their own reasons, because that's enough for them, and they can do that. Say, listen, they can say the Court of Appeals, we've examined the Court of Appeals judgment, and they've reasoned well. Their reasoning is sound, so therefore we reviewed, and there's no reason for cassation. We basically affirm, and that's it. But they don't sort of deliberate and offer their own reasoning. In this case. So both things happened. The Court of Cassation said, we reject the cassation and reiterate the Court of Appeals judgment, and then it kind of reiterated its own reasoning, many of which were adopted from the Court of Appeals judgment, and many from our arguments that we're presenting, and said that yes, listen, the Article 85, the civil procedure law applies to this, and that it's nothing against public morals, that this is the U.S. court was the original court, and so kind of went through all the elements of Article 85, stating specifically that this is a sound judgment from the right court with the right competence. The defendant had been properly served. It's not against public order, and the treaty is not required. So once again, they said the treaty is not required, which was huge. So, and on that basis, issued a decision reaffirming the Court of Appeals judgment, and voila, now we have a guiding principles, if not a binding principle, from the highest court in Dubai, that states the U.S. foreign judgment can be enforced in the UAE as long as it doesn't contradict public morals, and it does not require a treaty, and therefore, basically, we are enforcing this judgment in this country.
Okay, so I said at the beginning of this podcast, LY law making history, and this is precedent now, isn't it, in legal terms? However, if I'm a person of questionable ethics, morals, and it sounds like this person has, I think your words were, wreaked havoc in a number of different locations. So a judgment is passed against me in the US. I run away from that. A judgment is passed against me in the UAE. I would just up sticks and run away from that if I was that kind of a character. So how do you enforce a judgment when a person could just leave the UAE?
Very good question. And there's a few interesting dynamics to that. Is that, in a way, if you're that kind of person you just described, that sort of with questionable morals and character and that wreaks havoc in many places you go, at some point you run out of places, that at least you want to live in, right?
True.
At some point.
Sure.
So there's only so many sort of I don't want to misuse the term, but the sort of civilized places that you want to live in. I mean, I guess there's always the jungle somewhere or some abandoned island somewhere. But if you want to be part of civilization, there's only so many places you can go to with that kind of a questionable checkered history. So that's and that's perhaps also why the UAE has been so popular, is because a lot of people, they might have kind of felt unwelcomed in many other countries, but here. This isn't for many of them. It's kind of last frontier before the jungle, right? I mean, geographically, that is. So there's that, and then also, but kind of the flip side, and also one of the I guess, attributes of the UAE is that once you've lived here, it's so hard to leave this country. It's so comfortable. I mean, obviously, as every other country, there are issues and nuances, but more or less, it's a very comfortable country to live in, and it's very, it's everything is convenient, and especially if you have family, it's a great place to live. And so, over the years, people sort of make a nest here. And it's not so easy to get up and leave, right? Especially if you have family, and perhaps kids, wife, ex-wife, family, whatever other family members. It's not so easy to leave.
This is true.
So plus, as part of the other kind of add-on to the UAE lifestyle, is that people here tend to people move here. Some, not obviously, it's gross generalization, but people with money, and you have money. The UAE is very nice. This has a lot of ways to show off your money, right? Like fancy cars, nice homes, and very comfortable flights, and so people move here and they kind of want to live that lifestyle. So all of a sudden you got these fancy cars, maybe you have yachts, maybe you have jets, maybe you have nice homes and multiple homes. So it's not that easy to just pick up and leave. In other words, so when it comes down to it, how do you
It's not, and I grant you all of that, and you're absolutely right, because there's certainly an element, certainly in the media, of a real luxury lifestyle here, and lots of people live that, but not everybody does. But somebody still could get up and leave if there is a judgment there, and that's their character. They run away from obligation.
Sure. You're right, and that's always the concern. So, and that's one of the other. I'd like to think one of the strongest leverage of the UAE sort of judicial system, for those who are on the right side of the judicial system, that is that this principle is called enforcement of a judgment. And that means is that and you can apply for enforcement of a judgment after you have an appeal court decision. So, which means, in simple terms, is once you have a judgment from the Court of Appeals, not the Court of First Instance, but the Court of Appeals, then you can apply to the court as what's called the precautionary measures, or precautionary attachment. So it's kind of a precautionary, I guess, tools that you're putting in place to try to make sure that the person does not leave, or that they don't divest their assets. So you can move as part of this. So you can start enforcement proceedings. You're not seizing anything yet, but you can put freezes on things. Right.
Okay.
So because there's always a chance that verdict will be reversed on the Court of Cassation, and if it's reversed, then obviously you'd have to kind of reinstate everything. This is why the UAE judicial system has developed these tools where you can apply for enforcement on the basis of the Court of Appeals judgment, but as part of enforcement, the request you can make is, for example, you can if you have the details, or you can ask the court for these to help you find these details. Let's say you have the bank account number of defendant. You can say, please freeze this bank account to the tune of the judgment value. Or for example, I know the person has a home, so please freeze this home. Freeze a car, for example. They only freeze, right? So it's like, and the court don't grant all of these requests all the time. It really depends on the circumstances. It has to be a serious amount of money, a significant amount of money, and such. So, and one of the other requests could be that you can make is what's called the prevent the person from leaving the UAE. And again, this is what's called the part of the precautionary attachment, which the idea here is to prevent the person from doing a runner, from divesting all these assets, and knowing that finally there's this it's catching up, life is catching up with them, so let me just divest everything and pack up and leave. So there is that also a tool. It's temporary. So if ultimately the Court of Cassation reverses the judgment, that it all kind of just gets unfrozen, and that's that. But as part of this particular case on the Court of Appeals, we made requests for a travel ban, for example, so preventing the person from leaving the country, until the judgment is finished. And that's again because of a non-payment of a judgment amount, right? And you can start making requests already. So you're kind of proceeding with enforcement as if you already had the final judgment, but you can only do with whatever the assets you identify and locate. You can only hold on to them through the court's freezes.
Okay, so in this particular case, in this instance, this person can't leave the country, is here in the UAE, until the judgment is dealt with.
Yeah, because the idea is you can always leave, right? You just pay the judgment. So you pay the judgment, and and furthermore, there's also, you see, it's this is also important to underline or highlight, is that you can pay the judgment if you don't want all that sort of for your life to go to this sort of a freezing order, this tumultuous process. You just pay the judgment, and then you can still challenge it. You see, you can still go to the Court of Cassation. So listen, if the Court of Cassation gets reversed, you just reclaim your money. You see, because what you can do is pay the money. You can pay the money to the court. So you're not giving it to the claimant.
Right.
You're just depositing with the court. And that way you have no freezes. So that way, because there's these freezes on accounts or restriction to travel are only granted in cases where the person does not want to honor the court's judgment, the court's decision. So you're basically violating the authority's orders, right? And so it's only in those cases, but there's always a very easy way to address this. So you just pay the judgment, you pay the amount of judgment to the court, So it's still safe. Your money is safe. You pay to the court, and then you go ahead and you argue your case at the Court of Cassation. So then you have basically you have the ability to kind of then do both, preserve your interest, and at the same time have the freedom that maybe you are not ready to part with yet.
Okay, so when does the original claimant get their money back? If the money is paid to the court by the person who has had this judgment enforced upon them, and it's a debt, when does the claimant get their money back from the court? How does that work?
So it's only once you have the judgment from the Court of Cassation, and that means that the judgment is final.
From the very top.
Yes, from the very top. Either when you have the judgment from the Court of Cassation, which makes the judgment final, or when the Court of Appeals judgment is not appealed and then becomes final by virtue of it not being appealed.
Okay.
Right? So basically, but ultimately when the judgment becomes final, this is when you can now start the enforcement proceedings full force. And as part of the enforcement proceedings with the final judgment, on the basis of final judgment, then you can start requesting information. So and what you do is you ask the court to make requests to different authorities or different parties about the defendant. And that, again, that's only in the event that they're not paying the judgment. Right? It's very easy. You just pay the judgment and then you're done. You don't need to have that sort of investigation that needs to take place. But otherwise, what you do is you write the court, can you please write the central bank and have the central bank provide the details to the court where this person has bank accounts? Or can you please write to the land department and see if the person has properties? Can you write to their court, can you make a request to, let's say, a particular economic zone to see if the person has companies? Can you write, for example, to RTA, which is the Road Transportation Authorities, to see if the person has any vehicles? And so you kind of go through this due diligence investigative process. It's a detective work, but with the help of the court, right? So everything is done official to the court. The court will issue either specific letter to specific authority or will actually communicate directly with the authority. And then you kind of amass your database of information, because in every one of these requests is always limited and caveated to the extent of the judgment. So you cannot, for example, the person has a villa for 100 million dirhams and your judgment is for 200,000 dirhams. You cannot necessarily seize that villa. There's always there's always only to the extent of the judgment. And then basically, as you're finding these assets, then you can start liquidating them through the auctions and such, and that's in the event that the person doesn't come forward and pay. So the person can come to the court and say, "Okay, I'll pay on some sort of a scheduled payment plan, for example, a staged, like a settlement. They make a settlement offer to the court, not to the claimant so much, but through the court, and say, "Okay, can we pay this in installments, for example." But in any event, even if you're doing it as part of this installment plan, the enforcement proceedings remain. Because the idea here is that the court doesn't want you to do a runner, because if they approve the installment plan, it does not mean that, now you can leave the country and sell all your assets and disappear. So there's that's in that sense, the UAE legal system is very effective. It's and you can really and this is you can really I guess deploy some very effective tactics in cases like this to ultimately get people to basically responsible and responsible for their actions, because that's what it's about, right? It's basically there's an obligation, a legal obligation the person is ignoring.
It was bringing somebody to account, isn't it? And,
Absolutely.
I think I used the word navigate and re-navigate, and boy, did you do some navigation to get to this point. But it strikes me that this is this is a hugely significant event, essentially, in legal terms. Do you think it will make it easier now, or will it be that, I guess, foreign judgments will become more, prevalent? Because there is this precedence now that you guys have set.
I would hope so. I absolutely would hope so. And
it would seem that way.
And it should be. And for a number of reasons. One is because, as I mentioned, the courts in our case, the Court of Appeals and the Court of Cassation, were very specific in their reasoning. There wasn't just, yes, because sometimes this happens in some of the more perhaps routine cases where the Court of Cassation will just say, yes, we affirm the previous court's judgment. Here, both courts, higher courts, had a very detailed and very sound reasoning, right? And they, they rely on the specific laws. And they apply and they interpret these laws in the only way really you can. They should be interpreted, which is there is no requirement of a treaty. So therefore, we should not be requiring a treaty.
Yeah.
So there is also that, and and then as I said earlier, there was also the statement from the UAE Attorney General, kind of again with the same sentiment, and also I have to tell you, we have seen in the last few years, actually the last year, is that now some foreign countries are starting to enforce UAE judgments, and obviously that benefits the country here. So recently there was an English court, I think, that enforced the UAE judgment in England. So it's basically, it's a principle of comity. If you consider your kind of countries and jurisdictions and courts to be of more or less sort of equal footing, then you should want to, you should not have an issue with enforcing foreign judgments. But more importantly, I think for the UAE in particular is, I guess different accounts people can differ, but the UAE maybe by some accounts has had this reputation of harboring people who are running away from the law, like fugitives, just because it's been kind of an easy place for them to hide. The UAE doesn't want that reputation, and that's not the reputation it aims to sort of to establish, let alone kind of protect or preserve. So it wants to shed that reputation, and it's not necessarily that it's kind of consciously wanted to kind of play that role. It's just because the legal system was developing, and as part of the development of the legal system, there were these sort of nuances and that were kind of happening in legal terms that made it more difficult for foreign parties to enforce foreign judgments in the UAE. So it wasn't intentional per se. It's just that the laws needed a little bit of updating. And so I would say now for the UAE, it's a tremendous development. It's a tremendous accomplishment and precedent, and it should be sort of advertised and celebrated because the UAE shows to the world, if you've got a civilized, like a judgment, a good reason judgment from any other jurisdiction that ultimately, and that does not contradict our principles and morals, absolutely will enforce it. We would want to make sure that you would do the same. We do with our judgment on the same basis, as long as it doesn't contradict your public morals. But basically, just because people, so we don't want to have this reputation of in the world that people can come here and hide. People who are running away from the obligations, from criminals, con artists. We don't want that reputation. So absolutely, you have judgment. Come here, and we will. We absolutely have the legal framework and now precedent to enforce these judgments. And we've seen that recently with the tax fraud or tax evasion judgment. I think it was from Denmark, that also was being enforced here. But there was a criminal judgment, but still. So I think we're heading in that direction, and that's I think it's a positive change, and it will only highlight the UAE's reputation as a very progressive judicial system, and I would say certainly only benefits it's as a country and as an economy, because it instills a lot more confidence in other foreign countries that this country also has similar laws, robust legal systems, and it will honor the principles, the judicial principles of comity between foreign courts.
Final question for you, Ludmila. Taking into account everything you said, and it's some story. We've been talking for just over an hour about this, just one particular story. But what have you learned from the experience, and what would you advise others if if that might be a course that they would take to have a foreign judgment enforced here in the Emirates.
Well, interesting. So, because remember, what we're talking about is, again, not to be boastful about it, but I think we're making history. Making history means you are deploying somewhat novel arguments, novel approaches. So you don't want to be afraid you should not be afraid, because the law is changing. So be very vigilant. I guess that's one piece of it. But very, very vigilant of the new laws. And then once you identify, don't rely just on your experience from before of all how things used to be. Just keep your eye on the ball, because the laws are changing quite rapidly. 1, 2, don't be afraid now to utilize these new laws and try to be creative and inventive in trying to implement or assert or argue these new laws in the courts. And then 3, also don't be afraid, or perhaps even be mindful of not kind of sticking to your old practices and your old arguments. If you're arguing new arguments and making new arguments, make new and novel arguments, not old ones. Because what happened here in this particular case, the defendant's lawyers were making all the same recycled arguments which we have seen over the years here. And so many lawyers here make it just kind of, it's almost like you've got this sort of a bag of phrases or arguments, and they just, that's 30 years or 40 years old, and they just grab into that bag, pull out and recite it without actually reading what the arguments the claimant is making. So for example, they made arguments such as, the judgment was corrupt, or was fraudulent because the U.S. court had made some markings by hand, so sort of some changes by hand, some clarifications. Because there's some sort of handwriting, that means it's fraudulent. It's such an old and outdated argument. I've seen these arguments in the past. They were successful, right, in the past, in the courts here. But we've moved on. The times have moved on. The courts have moved on. But, when I came here 10 years ago, these are kind of arguments. It's like if you wanted to challenge the validity of the whole case, you challenge the validity of the document. Look, I don't have the original. You don't have the original. You don't have the original stamp, therefore the document is not original. That's how it used to be, but it's no more. Yeah. But yet, in this case, the defendant's lawyers were arguing basically just that. The court judgment was fraudulent because it had this sort of handwriting, or it was defective in reasoning and logic. Yeah, so exactly. But again, these...
Sorry, I didn't understand that.
Yeah, right, exactly. This is why. So it comes with these old goodie bags of arguments that are dated, maybe 5 or 7 years, or 5 years, too old. Yeah. But I've seen them being used often before. So I know where they're coming from, but they're coming from this sort of old bag that should not just be recycled, but like thrown away into the dump, because those arguments is no more. The courts don't really care about anymore. And in any event, of course, we are not reviewing the U.S. judgments, the U.S. court's judgments or reasoning. That's a substantive case. It's been decided there. We're here just basically only to enforce the judgment. So we're saying that the court's reasoning was flawed.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. This has been settled. Well, not settled, but this is a judgment from the US. That's done. That almost has nothing to do with it. It's just the fact that it needs to be... it's not ratification, but it needs to be recognized. And that's really what a foreign judgment is. It's recognizing that in the country. And then you can apply for enforcement. It's interesting that, because those arguments just do not compute. The other side, I think, it's worth making the point again, and we say this all the time, the legal framework here has changed. It's almost unrecognizable in the last 3 years. And clearly... You used the word progressive earlier on as a judicial jurisdiction, if you like. And that's exactly what the UAE now is, and I think should be recognized for.
Absolutely, and that's why we're talking about this today, because I think what the UAE courts have done with this judgment is exactly the manifestation of that they're progressive, that they are open, that they are very much mindful of the reputation that they want to create and foster in the world. They want to be deemed and considered on the world stage as an equal partner. They want their judgments to be recognized in other jurisdictions, and equally so, that's part of that they say absolutely we will if it's a well reasoned, if it's a valid judgment, we'll recognize it here as well. And we will not be this considered as a safe haven for people who run away from the law in other countries. If you have a judgment, we will absolutely enforce it as long as it does not violate public morals.
That is another edition of Lawgical. I think that's the longest we've ever spoken. 1 hour and 10 minutes or somewhere around there, Ludmila.
But remember, we're making history, so it's okay.
Well, I was just going to say that. Enforcement of foreign judgments, that's what we've been talking about here in the Emirates. And LY Law making history as well. So congratulations, I have to say that. As ever, thanks for watching, listening, or both. Thanks to our legal expert. That is, as always, the managing partner here at Yamalova and Plethka, Ludmila Yamalova. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Find us at LY Law, social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn. You can find all the podcasts at lylawyers.com or on your favorite podcast platform. If you'd like your legal question answered in an episode of Lawgical, or if you'd like to talk to a qualified UE experienced legal professional, click contact at lylawyers.com.